Eternal life. When I first held that tiny test tube in my hand, I couldn't help but smile. Inside it were only a handful of harvester ants, so small, so fragile, almost invisible against the glass. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing, just a few specks of life crawling around in circles. But to me, it was a universe waiting to unfold. You see, I've learned something over the years. Greatness almost never announces itself with trumpets or fireworks. No, it often begins in silence, in places so small that we nearly overlook them. A seed in the soil, a spark in the dark, a fragile heartbeat after surgery, even something as humble as ants in a test tube. And I wonder, do you remember the last time you started with nothing? Maybe it was when you and your spouse first got married, living in a one-bedroom apartment with hand-me-down furniture and chipped plates. Maybe it was when you lost your job and had to rebuild from scratch, unsure if you could pay next month's rent. Or maybe it was when you walked into a doctor's office and heard news that split your life into before and after. A patient of mine once told me, "Doctor, when I had my first heart attack, I thought it was the end. But then I saw the look in my wife's eyes, equal parts fear and fierce determination, and I realized I had to keep going." That moment, that fragile spark of human connection, became the seed of his recovery. When I watched my aunts in their tube, I thought of him, because in their own way, they too were fragile, but they carried within them the blueprint of survival, of growth, of community. I want you to picture this: the ants huddled together, their queen resting in the center. She was their heartbeat, their reason for being. Around her, the workers were restless, searching, protecting, ready for anything. And then I gave them their first challenge: a living mealworm dropped into the tube like a giant intruder. Now here's the dramatic part. In a matter of seconds, chaos erupted. The ants rushed forward with astonishing coordination. Half of them launched into attack, their jaws gripping the mealworm's armored shell, tearing at it with relentless strength. The other half stayed back, circling the queen and her larvae, shielding them from danger. I watched as stingers plunged into the worm venom, coursing through its body until it went limp. A creature 10 times their size was defeated, not because of brute force, but because of unity and purpose. And in that moment, I thought, aren't we the same? When disaster strikes, when something larger than life threatens us, we gather around those we love. We draw strength from numbers, from community, from knowing that none of us can do this alone. The ants had won their first battle. They had food, now a resource that would sustain them for days. But more importantly, they had proven something fundamental: that even the smallest of beings, when bound together, can overcome what seems impossible. It made me ask myself, and now I ask you, what is the mealworm in your life right now? That oversized, intimidating problem you think you cannot face. Perhaps it's your health. Perhaps it's financial worry. Perhaps it's loneliness. And maybe, just maybe, the lesson of the ants is this: you don't have to fight it alone. Because survival, whether for an ant colony or for a human being, is never about size or power. It's about connection. It's about knowing who you gather around when danger comes knocking. So as I watched them that night, a tiny colony sealed in glass, I realized I wasn't just looking at ants. I was looking at a mirror, a reflection of what it means to begin small, to face fear together, and to find strength in the ties that bind us. And that was only day one. By day 6, something had changed. The test tube, the tiny glass prison that once seemed vast, was now too small. The ants were restless, pressing against the walls, their bodies crowding the narrow space. It was as if they were telling me, we've outgrown this. We're ready for more. So I gave them a bigger home, a hybrid nest, a sprawling chamber of sand and tunnels connected by a thin vinyl tube. At first, silence. Then a single worker ant stepped forward. She wandered down the tube, hesitating at the unknown. She reached the new nest, explored its corners, then turned back. When she returned, she carried something invisible yet powerful: information. Within hours, the entire colony followed her lead. And I thought, isn't this how humanity works? One person dares to take the first step, and suddenly a path opens for everyone else. I remember a man in his 60s telling me his story. When my father died, he said, our family lost its anchor. We were all scared, drifting. But my older brother, he was the first to say, we'll be okay. And somehow, just hearing him, we all believed it. Like that lone ant, one person's courage can ripple outward, transforming fear into movement. The ants settled into their new nest quickly, and for a moment all was calm. But calm can become monotony, and monotony, even for ants, breeds a kind of restlessness. That's when I decided it was time to give them a taste of the real world. I built them a desert. Grain by grain, I layered dyed sand and coconut fiber, then scattered rocks and cactus, a dry, harsh expanse. I connected it to the nest with another vinyl tube. At first, only a few workers ventured in cautious, but then I sprinkled dandelion seeds across the sand, their favorite food. Suddenly, the desert came alive with movement. The ants swarmed outward, each carrying seeds back to the queen. And I thought of us again. Don't we do the same? When opportunities lie close, we hesitate. But when something we love, something nourishing appears just beyond our comfort zone, suddenly we dare to step out. A new career, a new friendship, a second chance at love, even in old age. But the desert held dangers too. One ant wandered too close to a pit. At first it seemed harmless, but then sand shifted. The ant slipped down. Beneath the surface, jaws snapped shut. An antlion larva had struck. The ant fought bravely, clamping down with its mandibles. But in the end, it was dragged beneath the sand, gone in an instant. It shook me. Because isn't that life? Sometimes you can do everything right and still fall prey to unseen traps. I knew a man who lost his retirement savings to a scam. He was careful, intelligent, but one wrong step and the ground gave way. His words haunt me still. It wasn't greed, doctor. It was trust. And I trusted the wrong pit. The ants continued to forage, but now with caution. They had learned that the world, though abundant, was also treacherous. And so had I. By the second week, the desert was no longer enough. The ants had learned its pathways, harvested its seeds, and skirted the dangers hidden in its sand. They had grown stronger, bolder. So I asked myself, what happens when a colony becomes too comfortable? What happens when growth slows, not because of limits, but because of routine? The answer was simple. It was time to challenge them with something new. And so I built a rainforest. I layered soil and moss, added rocks slick with moisture, planted grass seeds and sprigs of green. It was a place of abundance, yes, but also of shadows. A place where life thrived in tangled beauty, but where predators too could hide. When the ants first entered, they hesitated. The air was different, heavy with humidity. The ground was soft, damp, and strange under their feet. But within minutes, the pull of food drew them in. I had released flightless fruit flies into the foliage, tiny fluttering prizes that were just the right size for a single ant to drag home. The colony surged forward. Hunters chased the flies, seizing them with sharp jaws and carrying them triumphantly back to the queen. For a time, it looked like paradise. Food was everywhere, work was plentiful, and danger seemed far away. But paradise is never without its tests. One ant wandered onto the edge of a Venus flytrap. At first, it was harmless curiosity. The sweet nectar on the leaf lured her closer. She stepped across the trigger hairs, unaware that she was writing her own ending. Slowly, almost tenderly, the jaws of the plant closed around her. At first, she struggled, legs thrashing, body twisting. But the trap only grew tighter. In the coming days, enzymes would dissolve her into nothing but nutrients, a life exchange for the hunger of another. Watching it, I felt a quiet heaviness. Because isn't that how life often is? We move towards sweetness, unaware of the cost. How many of us have followed a temptation thinking it harmless, only to find ourselves trapped? It might be gambling, it might be drinking, it might be chasing wealth at the expense of health. Sweet at first, then suffocating. A woman once told me, "Doctor, I never thought one glass of wine a night would matter. But 20 years later, I found myself a prisoner." She too had stepped onto a leaf, not knowing it would close around her. But the rainforest had more trials in store. This time I introduced Jeremy, my jumping spider. Sleek, sharp-eyed fangs laced with venom. I hadn't fed him in days, so I expected him to attack the ants immediately. Instead, he darted into the foliage and hid. He refused to play the villain on cue, and yet his presence lingered like a shadow over the rainforest. The ants carried on, but every rustle of leaves, every tremor of motion, was a reminder danger lurked unseen. And isn't that how fear works? Sometimes the predator doesn't even need to strike. Its possibility alone shapes our choices, keeps us cautious, on guard. By day 15, the ants had turned the rainforest into a thriving hunting ground, their population swelling, their queen laying more eggs by the day. But the lesson was clear: abundance always comes with risk. A garden, no matter how green, always has thorns. And as I watched them, I wondered, what about us? What rainforest do we live in? We move through abundance, grocery stores overflowing with food, cities brimming with opportunities, screens flooding us with entertainment. But behind the sweetness, there are traps, predators, addictions waiting. The ants reminded me growth doesn't mean escaping danger. It means learning to live alongside it. By the third week, the colony had grown into something extraordinary. They had conquered the tube, survived the desert, and thrived in the rainforest. But I kept wondering what would happen if nature itself turned against them. After all, in the wild, survival isn't just about food or predators. It's about weathering the storms. So I decided to play the role of nature. In the desert outworld, I created a sandstorm. Armed with nothing more than a hairdryer, I pointed the blast of air across the sand. Suddenly, the quiet landscape turned violent. Grains of sand rose in clouds, whipping across the ground like tiny bullets. Ants that had been calmly foraging froze in shock. Some clung desperately to rocks and twigs, their bodies trembling under the force. Others tumbled across the sand, rolling helplessly until they found something to grip. I watched them fight against a world that had turned hostile in an instant. And I thought, isn't this what life does to us? One phone call from the doctor, one accident on the highway, one economic downturn. The storm doesn't ask if we're ready. It simply arrives and we're forced to endure. Over in the rainforest, I created something different. Instead of sand and wind, I summoned fog and rain. Moisture rolled in, clinging to the plants, dripping down into the soil. Soon droplets gathered and fell, tiny beads of water soaking into the ground. For the ants, it was both a blessing and a trial. The water was life essential to their survival, but too much of it too quickly could drown them. I watched as they scrambled to higher ground, carrying larvae to safety, adapting their behavior on the spot. And here I thought of an older man I once knew. He told me doctor retirement wasn't the freedom I expected. It was like the rain. I suddenly had time pouring down on me, and at first I nearly drowned in it. It wasn't until I found purpose volunteering at a local shelter that I learned to let that rain grow something, not wash me away. Adaptation, that was the lesson. Ants don't complain when storms come. They don't curse their fate. They simply adjust. They hold tighter, climb, higher, carry on. And maybe that's why they've survived for millions of years, while so many other species have vanished. I couldn't help but reflect, how often do we as humans resist change? We fight against the storms in our lives, insisting they're unfair, that we can't handle them. But maybe survival isn't about resisting. Maybe it's about bending, about shifting, about finding the one dry patch of soil to cling to while the storm rages. By day 20, the colony had endured both sandstorm and thunderstorm. They were battered, yes, but they were alive. And I realized something profound: storms do not destroy a colony or a life that knows how to adapt. So I ask you, what storm are you in right now? And instead of fighting it, what would happen if you let yourself adapt, to flow with it, to learn from it? Because in the end, storms will always come. What matters is whether we are willing to bend or whether we break. By day 28, the colony had endured storms, predators, deserts, and rainforests. They had grown into a small empire bustling with movement, their queen at the center, endlessly laying eggs. Watching them, I thought perhaps they had faced every test I could throw at them. But there was still one lesson left, one final trial I needed to give them. What happens when an intruder enters your home? It wasn't another storm. It wasn't a predator waiting in ambush. It was something more subtle, more insidious. I lifted the glass of their nest and placed inside a single dubia roach. A stranger, large and armored, dropped suddenly into their world. At first I expected chaos. I imagined the ants would swarm, jaws snapping, stingers plunging. But instead, silence. The roach crawled awkwardly down into the lower chambers. For several long minutes, not a single ant approached. And when one finally did, she froze, panicked, and flipped onto her back. It was almost comical, the tiny soldier trembling before this lumbering trespasser. But the roach was no conqueror. It was just as frightened, skittering, nervously searching for escape. And soon it found it, scuttling back through the tunnels and out into the desert outworld, disappearing forever. The queen was unharmed, the colony remained intact, and the battle I had expected never came. As I sat there, I realized I had just witnessed a different kind of strength. Sometimes defense isn't about fighting at all. Sometimes it's about patience, restraint, allowing danger to pass on its own. How often in life do we rush into battles that don't need to be fought? A harsh word from a neighbor, a heated political argument at the dinner table, a fear that gnaws at us in the middle of the night. We swarm it with anger, with panic, with energy, and in doing so, we often make it worse. But the ants showed me another way. They waited, they watched, and the intruder left on its own. I remember counseling a man once, someone who carried years of bitterness against his brother. Doctor, he said, I wasted decades fighting battles that didn't matter. I fought so hard to prove I was right that I lost sight of what I was fighting for. His voice broke. If I just let it go, maybe I'd still have my brother today. The ants reminded me of him. Not every intruder deserves a war. Some leave if you simply hold your ground and protect what matters most. By the end of 30 days, the colony had taught me more than I had ever expected. They began in a fragile test tube, and now they thrived across deserts and rainforests, weathering storms, outsmarting predators, and facing intruders. Some ants had been lost, yes, but the community endured. The queen survived. Life went on. And isn't that the ultimate story of all living things? We suffer losses. We endure trials. We meet intruders we never invited. But if we know what matters, if we protect our heart, our loved ones, our purpose, then survival is not just possible, it is inevitable. So I leave you with this thought. What intruder is haunting your life right now? And is it truly worth the fight? Or is the wiser path perhaps simply to wait, knowing that sometimes even the darkest trespassers will pass on their own? 30 days, that's all it was. A single month in the life of a harvester ant colony. Yet as I look back, it feels like I've witnessed a lifetime, a story of beginnings, trials, growth, and survival. They began in a fragile test tube, their world no larger than a thumb. They faced predators in the desert, temptations in the rainforest, storms that shook their foundations, and intruders that threatened their very home. And yet here they are, alive, thriving. Their queen still at the center, laying the future egg by egg. As I sit here reflecting, I realize the ants weren't just a colony. They were a mirror, a lens held up to our own lives. Because isn't life at its core the same? We all start small, whether it's a family, a career, or even the fragile beat of a newborn's heart. We grow, we explore, we face deserts of scarcity and rainforests of abundance. We stumble into traps, sometimes of our own making. We weather storms we never asked for. We endure intruders we never invited. And through it all, if we hold to what matters, our families, our communities, our purpose, we survive. We even thrive. I think of an elderly patient who once told me, life isn't measured by the years you live, doctor. It's measured by the storms you survive and the people still holding your hand at the end. That stayed with me because that is the essence of this colony too. Not the number of ants, not the size of the nest, but the fact that after everything they still had each other. And maybe that's what we forget sometimes. We get caught up in numbers, money in the bank, years on the calendar, trophies on the wall. But what if the true measure of a life is not accumulation, but endurance? Not how much we gathered, but how much we carried each other through. The ants taught me patience. They taught me courage. They taught me that survival is never solitary. It is always shared. And as strange as it sounds, I believe they also taught me humility. Because when you peer into a test tube and see creatures 1,000 times smaller than yourself enduring battles, you can hardly imagine it makes you pause. It makes you realize maybe we are not as different as we think. 30 days. To the ants, it was a season of struggle and triumph. To me, it was a reminder life is fragile, unpredictable, and yet endlessly resilient. So I ask you this as we close this journey together. If your life were an ant colony, what would its legacy be? What would you want to leave behind for those who come after you? Because in the end, survival is not the story. Continuity is. Connection is. The queen laying eggs, the family passing down, values, the love that outlasts even the hardest storms, that is the true victory. The ants will go on expanding, exploring, facing whatever comes. And so will we.